Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the 7th annual China-EU high-level economic and trade dialogue convened in Beijing. Can Chinese and European cooperation safeguard the global trading system against a protectionist United States? Turkish President Erdogan has won a new 5-year term in the Turkish general election. With his domestic mandate secure, will Erdogan now have the confidence to pivot towards new international alliances? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our program today with trade frictions. Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose a 10% tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, worsening a tit-for-tat trade spat with China. Besides China, the U.S. has also levied steel and aluminum tariffs on the European Union earlier this month. At a time when unilateralism and trade protectionism is on rise, Beijing is now hosting the China-EU high-level economic and trade dialogue. What does it mean to the escalating global trade friction? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Defending free trade. During the Central Conference on Work Relating to Foreign Affairs held in Beijing over the weekend, Chinese President Xi Jinping stressed that China should help reform and improve the global governance system and establish a better network between international partners. This follows President Xi's promise to honor his word by further opening up the country's economy.
I announced some major measures to open up the economy. Do not think that these steps have been forgotten. I have been honoring my words with actions. I had announced that we will significantly and vigorously broaden market access, create a more attractive investment climate, strengthen intellectual property protection, and take the initiative to expand imports as well as other major measures.
China and the EU are working together to prevent unilateralism and protectionism. During the 7th annual China-EU high-level economic and trade dialogue on Monday, both sides agreed that dialogue generated a wide breadth of consensus.
We must also show that our relationship delivers tangible economic benefits for both sides. I'm particularly pleased that our investment negotiations have now reached the stage where we are ready to exchange market access offers at the EU-China summit.
The first round of U.S. tariffs on China are scheduled to take effect on July 6th. And the U.S. levied steel and aluminum tariffs on the European Union earlier this month. EU countries are set to retaliate with tariffs on a variety of American products, which will take effect next month. Mr. Trump's tariff policy does not sit well with its trading partners, leaving the world's biggest economy the odd one out.
For more discussion about this, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Mr. Rong Ying, Vice President of the CIIS, China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., U.S., Derek Caesars, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome as well. Mr. Rong, first question to you. What does it mean at this critical juncture when July the 6th is approaching between China and the United States, and China is in a very high tune hosting this China-EU trade dialogue?
Well, of course, the annual dialogue between China and the EU is significant and illustrative in the sense that both China and the EU are facing the pressure or danger of a kind of war or trade dispute with the United States. And the very fact that the two sides now partner together to find a way to address the issues is significant. The most important thing I believe is two, actually. One is, of course, the pledge and the commitment to the global trading, rule-based global trading system with the WTO at the center, upholding unilateralism. And the other thing is that they have made really tangible and concrete agreements on how to manage their disputes through talks and dialogues.
Right. Well, China and America be able to do the same, Mr. Caesars, through dialogue and discussion? Well, July the 6th is really approaching when the U.S. is deciding on impose tariffs on 34, in a way, Chinese goods, billion Chinese goods going to the United States.
I don't think dialogue between China and the U.S. is going to start before July 6th. It's certainly not going to conclude. You know, the U.S. has already imposed some tariffs on steel and aluminum globally. I think the U.S. government wants to impose that $34 billion worth of tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods from China. I will say that $34 billion is not very much. It's a little warning shot. And if that starts the negotiations before a broader trade conflict, then it will have served a positive purpose. So July 6th is looming, as you said, but I'm not sure that's the important date. I think the important date is to prevent the trade conflict from spreading after July 6th.
Well, when July the 6th is approaching, Mr. Rong, we are already hearing from the U.S. side that a piece of legislation is now being written, suggesting that Chinese share more than 25% of any company to invest in so-called industrially technological sector in the United States will be prohibited. Of course, this legislation, even when it came out, draft, it needs a period of time to select rather, comments coming from the American society. Having said that, though, what does it mean for China?
I think let me start with what it would mean for the United States if this proposal is put into practice, because that reminds me in English saying that to cut one's nose to spite his face, because if this kind of proposal becomes a policy, it will definitely hurt the United States as well. While I'm not sure whether it would hurt the Chinese so much, because with that policy in place, I think China would be forced to push or to work even harder for its own development, pursuit of technology, while the job losses because of the reduction or limitation of Chinese investment in U.S. will be huge.
But reasoning, we have heard it a lot recent months. I mean, between China and the United States, many of those economies have spoken out, but these doesn't work. I mean, for the current administration, Mr. Caesars, so lose-lose situation. It seems that nobody cares. Let it be. From the U.S. side, is it?
Well, I mean, there is very little Chinese investment in the U.S. right now to restrict. Chinese investment in the U.S. was very high in 2016. It's very low now for a number of reasons. And so there's not a lot of loss
given
there
the current circumstances.
at present time.
They're leaving,
well, that's
actually.
right. I mean, so we've already seen changes in the U.S.-China economic relationship. And right now, and I do not mean to say this will last forever, but right now the U.S. economy is extremely strong. So when you ask if people in the United States care, what they see right now is a U.S.-China economic relationship that is in some difficulty, but the U.S. economy right now is very strong. It's hard for people to focus on the fact that an economic conflict between China and the United States will cause harm to the U.S. at the present time.
Even though you heard at the hearing by Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, there are quite a number of questions coming from both sides of the aisle, questioning about the current strategy taken by the administration right now in trade issues with China. Some have been also suggesting this is going to be a lose-lose situation. Some also use history as a mirror, for example, what's going on between United States and Japan, what is going on between United States and its ally these days as well. So, Mr. Caesars, will these voices matter at all before July the 6th?
Before July the 6th, no, they won't. You know, I think the U.S. and China are considering talks, but we just had an attempt to solve the trade conflict in May, where Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin said, okay, the trade war is on hold, and it fell apart. So I don't think if we were unable to solve the trade conflict in May, I don't think we'll be able to solve it before July 6th. As I said, you know, and as you have said, the new American restrictions, they require a public hearing process. And that process will allow more voices to step forward and say, okay, right now this is okay because our economy is strong. But what will happen next year? Perhaps we should reconsider.
Public hearing process, usually how long would that be for a legislation like that if it ever comes out with a draft?
Well, it's supposed to happen on the actions are supposed to be released on Friday of this week, and then usually the public hearing process is 60 days. So it would go to the end of August. That's a very awkward time because not much happens in Washington in August. So perhaps they will lengthen that process, although we don't know that. In any case, there is time to negotiate in July and August if the two sides wish to.
Mr. Rong, here is some comments coming from different sides suggesting it's easy to start a battle. However, no one knows how to wrap it up. That's going to be the issue here. Well, the current administration in the U.S. might not be considering that much when they look at their political timetable for this year. China has to think about that, Mr. Rong.
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, the concern I think people are having, both in the United States and, of course, here in China, that it's easy to start a kind of a war or conflict, and it's difficult to stop it. So the escalation problem is always there. And I noticed that a lot of American sort of analysis and economists are talking about the prospect and the impact on the U.S. economy, even though it is very good. I think that this, in addition to the possible impacts on the economies of China and the United States, we have to also worry about the impact on the global economy in June. After all, China and the United States, I mean, being the second largest economy, we have a responsibility to make sure the economy will continue to enjoy growth and development.
Last week, the Chinese President Xi Jinping gave a speech, in fact, at a conference on China's foreign affairs. I'm sure both of you have read into some of his words. He urged efforts to firmly safeguard China's sovereignty, security, and development interests, take an active role in leading the reform of the global governance system, and build a more complete network of global partnerships. All these words might sound abstract, but people are thinking, if they look at these big words, international trading system, global governance, and also China has been suggesting about the community of shared future, Belt and Road Initiative. These keywords could really jump into people's mind. And Mr. Caesars, so many also wonder what's going to happen after November this year in the United States. If political needs is so urgent, but what about after that? Do you think Washington needs to think about that question, even though the battles between the two parties could be severe right now?
Of course we do. The U.S. and China have a very large and now multi-decade economic relationship. We should not be thinking about it here in the U.S. in terms of the next 6 months. But it's very easy for me to say that. I am not running for office. So I think we need to understand the political situation in the U.S., not make excuses for it, but simply understand it. It will be difficult for the U.S. to take long-term trade positions in the next 6 months because of the election. Then there will be a period where there is very little political pressure, and then the political pressure starts again. This is the way it is in a democracy. It's not ideal, but as you have suggested, the time to maybe solve this problem, if it can be solved, would be the beginning of next year when the political pressure is much lower.
But the thing is, if the atmosphere got really sour, things would be very difficult to hold on. If you talk about the tariffs and the relationship between the United States and some of its major trading partners, here's what President Trump tweeted. He really does this every morning, by the way, and this is what he said recently. If you look at the transcript we got over there on the screen, certainly he's talking about other countries taking advantage of the United States for long, and now the U.S. needs to fight back. That's mainly the meaning of the whole tweet. So, Mr. Rong, at the current critical juncture, 35B is likely to happen on July the 6th. China also has prepared its own set of reactions toward the U.S. possible actions. But the question is, how about after that? Will China still hold the responsibility of trying to save the situation, even though the other side has not really tried?
I think China has made it clear consistently that it's ready to talk if the United States want to talk. But China, as a sovereign country, I think it got the certainly got the right to defend its safeguard its legitimate interest. And in the meantime, I think if you judge the statements of the Chinese government, it also made very clear as a responsible power country, it will also want to make sure that the overall situation, and particularly here I'm talking about the global economic development stability, will not be affected. But it takes two to tango. So I believe that China will continue to uphold the principle to defend its interests. In the meantime, I only hope that the United States will also the cool-mindedness will follow, and it will work together continuously with China in a responsible way to manage this trade issue.
All right. Mr. Caesars, as a very seasoned Washingtonian, as one who has been closely looking at China-U.S. relationship for decades, I mean, from your perspective, if you look at the political situation right now in Washington, it's very entangled. The immigration problem, plus trade, and plus some of the investigations going on. There's a lot on the table. So the question is, what's going to be the trade card for politics these days?
Well, I think the president very clearly sees or believes that to be tough on trade, not just with China, but as you've mentioned, with Europe as well, is a politically winning strategy for him. I am not a U.S. political expert, as you mentioned. I spent a long time on U.S.-China relations, not on U.S. politics. But many political experts have said that the president won his very narrow victory by telling American industrial workers that he would change our trade policies away from the trade policies that they believe cost them their jobs or has pushed down their wages. So I think with the immigration fight, with the legal battles that are occurring in Washington, the president sees politically an advantage here for being tough on trade with most of America's partners. Now, you have said in the program correctly that there are costs to the United States for doing that. There's no question about this, but on the whole, the president believes that toughness with regard to China and perhaps others helps him politically.
So what does that mean, Mr. Rong, for China in a way, about its own structural reform? Remember, Chinese President Xi Jinping just a few days ago has been committing to the international community and also some of the visiting foreign dignitaries about China's further opening up policy. You also hear from the central bank governor about some of the recent reforms in the financial sector, including the bank ratios, so reserve ratios. So you see a lot of things is happening with China's own rhythm. So during this process, which is tough for China, obviously, because U.S. is one of China's biggest trading partners, that's for sure. But how is China likely to pace it well so that its own agenda of development will be realized no matter what?
I guess 3 points. One is China has made it very clear, President Xi in his speech at the Boao Forum this year, and also the other statements by other Chinese senior officials, that China will continue to reform and open up, because this year, of course, marks the 40th anniversary, and China for the past 40 years has benefited from that and will continue to do that. It is a political statement. It is also, I guess, out of the pragmatic reason that it is the only way for China to continue to enjoy development. The second thing is, of course, China is ready to work with other partners, like what they did today with the EU, to find a way to manage their problems, to trade disputes and so on and so forth. The third point, which I believe that China would not like to be pushed around. I think like the Canadian Prime Minister made it very clear, even Canadian does not want to push around. So China is a big power, I think that would not like to put, and it will continue to follow its own road of development according to its own needs at its own pace, but no push around at all.
Mr. Caesars, for really change the U.S. trading situation, from your perspective, what does the United States really need to do? I mean, once again, we want you to go back to your role as an observer of China-U.S. relations for decades.
Yeah, so this is the big problem on the American side. It's that we have no consensus here on what we want. And my Chinese counterparts have said this to me in private. Certainly people say this in public. It is unclear what the American goals are. The president wants a smaller trade deficit between the U.S. and China. I don't think that's important. What I would like is to see Chinese trade practices and American trade practices be similar. Obviously, the societies are different, so this is quite a challenge. But if you have different trade practices by the two countries, it immediately allows people in either country to say this is unfair because the two countries are behaving differently. So a problem for the United States is the president wants a smaller trade deficit. Other people like me, who follow U.S.-China more, would like the two countries to harmonize their trade and investment practices more closely. Those are different goals, and it leads to a U.S. policy that is quite hard to understand sometimes.
Right, Mr. Caesars, because that's something short-term and long-term. And in order to achieve these two different goals, there are very different ways to do things. Actually, some of the things being done right now are exactly harming the potential of doing things for the long term. So that is the big question, catch-22 situation here, Mr. Caesars.
That's right. I mean, I think for people to be fair to the American position, which I just said is hard to understand sometimes, a lot of people have been frustrated by the U.S.-China relationship. I say this as you said, multi-decade observer of the relationship, have been frustrated by the relationship on the American side for many years. And what happened was the previous administrations did not really do anything about this. And we've had a sudden change from the Obama administration, which did very little, talked but did very little, to the Trump administration, which is, you know, more like screaming and threatening to do many, many things to change the relationship. So there's been a bit of built-up frustration on the American side, whether you think it's justified or not. It's all coming out at once. It's very difficult to handle because, as you said, this should be a long-term process, but the U.S. is frustrated and wants to make it a short-term process.
Right. Whether the current actions and rhetorics are strategic or actually just the short-term way of doing things, that, of course, the American friends will be able to answer that better than the Chinese side. However, before we go, Mr. Rong, here is the thing. No matter what exactly is the long-term or the short-term goal of the other side, China doesn't know what it wants to do in the future.
Well, that's exactly the question I think a lot of Chinese are asking, particularly those, the average, Chinese who has an interest in following the relationship. Remember, this year marks next year marks the 40th anniversary of the relationship, the establishment of diplomatic relations. And trade issues, economic, always the ballast on the propeller for the relationship, for the stable relationship. And the trade deficit, for the United States perspective, has long history, starting from 1976. And the trade dispute between China and has always been there.
Okay.
But the approach to deal with that is changed. So a lot of people are looking at the reasons that underline this. And of course, a lot of people would like to refer to the so-called three strategic reports, naming China as the strategic competitor or rival and so on and so forth. So I think at this critical moment, both China and the United States definitely can work together so that these specific issue will not become a strategic problem and undermine the stable relationship.
Will they be or not be? That's really the question. But for now, thank you so much, both of you, Rong Ying, Derek Caesars, for being with us. Really appreciate it.